There are moments that divide a person's life into two chapters. One chapter is filled with silence, compromise, and pain that no one else notices. The other begins with a single decision that changes everything forever. For Emily Carter, that moment arrived beneath the glittering lights of one of the most prestigious charity galas in the United States. Before anyone could understand what they were about to witness, one marriage, one business empire, and one carefully protected reputation were already on the verge of collapse. Everyone believed they knew exactly who Emily was. They believed she was simply the quiet wife of a celebrated businessman. They believed she was fortunate to stand beside a man whose name appeared on magazine covers and whose speeches inspired investors across the country. They believed Richard Carter had built his success through talent, determination, and vision. What they didn't know was that every assumption they carried into that ballroom would be turned upside down before the night was over. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this remind us that the truth often hides in plain sight, and sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the very ones holding the greatest secrets. The annual Hamilton Foundation Charity Gala had become one of the most anticipated social events in the country. Invitations were limited to influential business leaders, respected philanthropists, prominent attorneys, political figures, celebrities, and executives responsible for managing companies worth billions of dollars. Months before the event, newspapers speculated about the guest list. Luxury brands competed to sponsor the evening, while television crews waited outside hoping to capture the arrivals of the nation's wealthiest families. For many attendees, appearing at the gala was just as important as donating to the foundation itself. It was where reputations were strengthened, partnerships were formed, and fortunes quietly changed hands over conversations that lasted only a few minutes. Richard Carter loved evenings like this. Every smile directed toward him reinforced the image he had spent years creating. He walked through the ballroom greeting investors, accepting compliments, and shaking hands with people eager to be associated with his growing influence. He knew exactly when to laugh, when to appear humble, and when to speak confidently about leadership and generosity. To the outside world, Richard represented the American dream. He had transformed a struggling regional company into a respected corporation and regularly appeared on television discussing business ethics, charitable giving, and family values. Few questioned the story he told about himself because he told it so convincingly. Walking several steps behind him was Emily Carter. Unlike nearly every woman attending the gala, Emily wore a simple black evening gown that attracted little attention. She chose elegance instead of extravagance, wearing no diamonds, no designer necklace, and no expensive bracelet. The only jewelry visible on her was the plain wedding ring resting quietly on her left hand. Guests glanced at her politely before returning their attention to Richard. Some assumed she disliked social events. Others believed she simply lacked confidence. A few whispered that Richard deserved someone more glamorous to match his growing success. Emily heard none of the comments, or perhaps she had learned long ago that responding would only invite more judgment. She carried herself with calm dignity, offering gentle smiles to strangers who rarely remembered her name. What no one could see was that Emily had spent years mastering the art of remaining invisible. She knew how to stand silently while conversations flowed around her. She knew how to smile through remarks that chipped away at her confidence. She knew exactly when to speak and, more importantly, when saying nothing protected her from further humiliation. To those watching from a distance, her quiet nature appeared natural. Only Emily understood that silence had become a survival skill. Richard had not always spoken to her this way. In the early years of their relationship, he admired her thoughtful personality and often described her as the calm influence that balanced his ambitious nature. Friends remembered the couple as affectionate and deeply connected. They attended neighborhood gatherings, celebrated birthdays with close friends, and talked openly about building a future together. But success has a way of revealing qualities that remain hidden when life is simple. As Richard's influence expanded, so did his need to control every part of his world. Praise became an expectation rather than a privilege. Criticism became something he refused to tolerate. Slowly, The warmth that once defined their marriage disappeared behind constant correction, subtle insults, and carefully disguised humiliation delivered with a smile convincing enough that outsiders mistook it for harmless humor. By the time they entered the gala that evening, Emily already knew exactly how the night would unfold. Richard would spend hours entertaining important guests while reminding her, directly or indirectly, that her role was to remain in the background. She would nod politely, thank people for their compliments, and quietly endure another evening that would leave her emotionally exhausted. Nothing about the event seemed unusual, at least not at first. As dinner progressed, the atmosphere became increasingly festive. Glasses were raised to celebrate generous donations. Business leaders exchanged promises of future partnerships. Cameras captured photographs destined for newspapers and financial magazines the following morning. The foundation's chairman announced that the evening had already raised record-breaking contributions, earning enthusiastic applause from every corner of the ballroom. Richard stood proudly among the honored guests, convinced this would become another successful chapter in his carefully managed public image. Then came the moment that changed everything. While speaking with a circle of influential investors near the front of the ballroom, Richard noticed Emily approaching to stand beside him. She said nothing. She simply joined him as countless spouses had done throughout the evening. Richard looked toward the group, smiled confidently, and then turned toward his wife with an expression that seemed playful to anyone who didn't know him well. His next words echoed across the nearby tables. "Would someone please tell my wife to stop embarrassing me?" For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then scattered laughter rippled through the ballroom. Some guests laughed because they assumed it was an innocent joke. Others laughed because Richard Carter was the one telling it. A few lowered their eyes, recognizing the discomfort on Emily's face but choosing not to interfere. Years of public admiration had made Richard almost untouchable. Challenging him in front of his peers carried risks few people were willing to take. Emily remained perfectly still. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. Instead, she looked around the ballroom with remarkable calmness, almost as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. A gentle smile appeared on her face, one so peaceful that it puzzled the handful of guests who noticed it. Without saying a word, she turned away from Richard and began walking toward the stage where the evening's final presentation was about to begin. Richard barely looked at her. He assumed she was leaving to hide her embarrassment, just as she had done countless times before. The conversations around him resumed. Laughter returned. Glasses clinked together as the evening continued almost normally. No one realized they had just witnessed the final insult Emily Carter would ever accept. Within the next few minutes, the woman nearly everyone had ignored would speak only a handful of words, and those words would expose a truth powerful enough to bring one of the room's most admired men to the edge of losing everything he believed belonged to him. Emily Carter calmly walks toward the stage after Richard publicly humiliates her. Instead of immediately revealing the truth, the story pauses and takes viewers back several years to understand who Emily really is. Everyone believes she is simply Richard's quiet, dependent wife, but subtle clues begin to emerge that suggest there is far more to her than anyone realizes. Employees at certain companies greet her with unusual respect. An elderly attorney repeatedly tries to reach her. Longtime staff members quietly refer to her as Miss Carter instead of Mrs. Carter. Richard dismisses these moments without giving them a second thought. Meanwhile, the narrator explores how Emily deliberately chose a life away from wealth and public attention, believing that genuine love could only exist if people never knew her family's true identity. The act ends with the revelation that Emily has been hiding one life-changing secret from her husband since the day they met. The story moves back to the beginning of Emily and Richard's relationship. Richard was once charming, thoughtful, and ambitious, making Emily believe she had finally found someone who loved her for who she was rather than her family name. They built a happy life together, but everything began changing after Richard's career exploded. Success transformed his personality, replacing kindness with arrogance and admiration with control. His criticism became constant. Every achievement belonged to him, while every mistake somehow became Emily's fault. Friends slowly disappeared from Emily's life as Richard isolated her from the people who cared about her most. Still, Emily refused to reveal her family's fortune because she hoped the man she married would eventually become the man she first fell in love with. Unknown to Richard, every painful moment only strengthened Emily's resolve to keep her secret until the right time. The narrator reveals the truth that has remained hidden from both Richard and the audience. Emily is the sole beneficiary of one of America's oldest private investment families. Decades earlier, her grandfather created an enormous holding company whose investments quietly expanded into banking, real estate, manufacturing, technology, and the very corporation Richard proudly leads today. To protect the family legacy, the ownership structure was placed inside an anonymous trust managed by experienced trustees. Emily never wanted to be known for her wealth and refused to interfere with the companies under the trust's control. Richard spent years believing he had climbed to the top entirely on his own, never realizing that the company defining his reputation ultimately answered to the trust owned by his wife. The act closes with Emily receiving a message informing her that the board has approved every document she requested before the gala. The story returns to the charity gala moments after Richard insults Emily. While he continues entertaining influential guests, Emily quietly steps onto the stage. The audience assumes she has been invited to offer a brief thank you speech, but several senior executives exchange nervous glances, knowing something significant is about to happen. Richard continues smiling, completely unaware that events are slipping beyond his control. Emily introduces herself using her full legal name for the first time that evening. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changes instantly. Members of the board stand to acknowledge her presence. Senior executives who ignored her moments earlier suddenly recognize the woman they have known only through confidential documents and private meetings. Richard begins to realize that his wife is somehow connected to people he has spent years trying to impress, but he still cannot imagine the truth waiting for him. Emily calmly explains that the holding company financing Richard's corporation has always been controlled by her family's trust, and that she is its sole owner. The room falls silent as she confirms that every major expansion, acquisition, and financial rescue credited to Richard's leadership was only possible because of resources approved by the trust. She reveals that the board has unanimously voted to remove Richard from his position, effective immediately, after reviewing evidence of unethical leadership and repeated abuse of authority. Richard desperately tries to interrupt, but no one comes to his defense. For the first time in years, he discovers what it feels like to lose control while standing before the same people who once admired him. Emily reveals that her decision was never motivated by revenge alone. Over many months, she quietly documented Richard's mistreatment, collected testimony from employees, and uncovered financial misconduct hidden within the company. Independent investigators verified every allegation before the gala ever began. As security escorts Richard away from the stage, former employees finally speak openly about years of intimidation and abuse. The carefully crafted public image Richard spent decades building collapses within a single evening. Emily reminds the audience that power should never exist without accountability, and that true leadership begins with respect for others, regardless of their position or status. Several months later, Emily assumes leadership of the company, but refuses to govern through fear or personal vengeance. She introduces programs that improve employee well-being, expands charitable initiatives, and rebuilds the workplace culture around fairness and integrity. Former employees describe the dramatic changes. While the company regains the public's trust under Emily's leadership, Richard quietly disappears from the business world, remembered not for his success but for the choices that destroyed everything he valued. The narrator concludes by reflecting that appearances can be deceiving, wealth can remain invisible, and respect cannot be purchased. Emily's greatest victory was never reclaiming a company that already belonged to her. It was reclaiming the confidence and dignity that no amount of money could ever replace. The story closes by asking viewers what they would have done if they had stood in Emily's place and whether public humiliation was justice, or simply the consequence of years of unchecked cruelty.